What if I told you that terrorists in Africa are being armed with NATO-grade weapons by a country that's supposed to be fighting for its own survival? That's not a conspiracy theory. That's what Russia just exposed in Kazan. Ukraine, the West's golden ally, is allegedly fueling chaos in the Sahel. And guess who's caught in the crossfire? Captain Ibrahim Traore and the people of Burkina Faso. This isn't just politics, it's betrayal. Africa's being turned into a battlefield, and no one's talking about it. So if you believe the truth matters, like, share, and subscribe, because what's coming next is chilling. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall against global giants, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice on its own terms, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traore's eyes and felt something awaken within you, then this story belongs to you too. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, not just to show support, but to walk beside us. We are not just watching history, we are part of a quiet storm rising. The whispers have become a roar, and Africa is finally speaking. And that brings us to Kazan, the moment everything changed. It was meant to be just another summit. The Global Digital Forum, June 5, 2025. 31 African nations gathered to discuss satellites, data sovereignty, and the future of connectivity. Captain Ibrahim Traore sat among them, representing a region dreaming of independence through innovation. But what happened next had nothing to do with fiber optics. A Malian delegate stepped forward, not to speak about infrastructure, but infiltration. In a voice that cut through diplomatic small talk, he made a stunning accusation: Ukraine was recruiting, arming, and positioning terrorists across the Sahel. Gasps followed, but this was no theater. Russian officials backed the claim. Then came confirmation from Mali's Transitional Security Council: weapons meant for Ukraine had ended up in the hands of militants in West Africa. Captain Traore didn't flinch. He had long warned that the chaos in the Sahel wasn't organic, that someone somewhere was keeping the fire burning, but few expected the finger to point at Kyiv. The room fell into silence, and in that silence a realization spread. This wasn't just another conflict. This was a battlefield hidden in plain sight, and Africa was the one bleeding. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, the weapons began to speak for themselves. These weren't rusty rifles or homemade bombs. Militants in the Sahel were suddenly armed with American-made M4s, NATO standard gear, encrypted radios, even drones marked with Ukrainian inscriptions. Men who had never touched a computer were now coordinating attacks with GPS precision. Farmers, herders, teenagers from remote villages. Captain Ibrahim Traore knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't local. This was training. Sophisticated, deliberate foreign training, and the evidence kept stacking. During counter-terrorism raids in Mali, soldiers recovered advanced equipment never seen before on the black market. Hidden in abandoned compounds were manuals written in Cyrillic and Ukrainian. Surveillance tech, targeting systems, and first-person view drones, built for more than just scouting, these were weapons of calculated war. Captain Traore, who had warned that the Sahel was being turned into someone else's chessboard, now had the missing pieces. This wasn't random violence. This was supply. This was strategy. And whoever was behind it was playing for keeps. The question that haunted every official in that room was simple: if these men were the pawns, then who exactly was moving them? But the most chilling moment wasn't a leak. It was a confession broadcast live. In August 2024, during a televised interview on Ukraine's national broadcaster, something extraordinary happened. Andriy Yusov, spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence, casually admitted that Ukrainian operatives had provided intelligence to rebel groups in Mali. Not speculation, not rumor. A state official on camera confirming involvement in a foreign conflict where dozens had died. Captain Ibrahim Traore, watching from Ouagadougou, didn't need further proof. For him, this was the mask coming off. The attack in question was brutal. 84 Russian mercenaries were killed, So were 47 Malian soldiers, men who had sworn to protect their homeland. But only the Russian deaths made headlines. Western media ignored the Africans as if their sacrifice didn't count. Traoré was furious. To him, the silence wasn't just insulting, it was revealing. It showed whose lives the world considered valuable and whose were disposable, and still no UN inquiry, no Western condemnation. Ukraine called the reports politically motivated and the world moved on. But in the Sahel, that admission echoed like a gunshot. Captain Traoré and his allies knew then what many feared to say aloud: Africa wasn't collateral damage, it was the target. And when you follow the trail deeper, it leads to one brutal truth. This was never just about Mali. It was a message, a warning, a punishment for disobedience. As the Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and under the fearless leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, began turning away from France, and aligning with Russia, the backlash came swiftly. But it didn't come through diplomacy. It came through firepower, through sabotage, through chaos seeded from afar. Intelligence reports suggest that Ukraine, backed quietly by Western allies, supplied the Tuareg rebels with critical military data and equipment. These weren't just hand-me-downs, they were mission-ready systems capable of guiding drone strikes with deadly accuracy. And the timing telling. Just as the AES alliance formalized its security partnership with Russia, violence in the Sahel escalated. Militants gained capabilities far beyond their means. Drones marked in Ukrainian tactical gear and encrypted communication channels all pointed to a coordinated effort. The intent was clear: destabilize the region, fracture its unity, and make an example of those who dared break from Western control. Captain Ibrahim Traore had warned of this before, that Africa's sovereignty wouldn't be handed away, it would be wrestled for. That the real war was not between armies, but between visions, one of submission and another of self-determination. For Traoré, the blood spilled in the Sahel was not just the cost of rebellion, it was the price of refusing to kneel. And still, the West remained silent. No sanctions, no headlines, no justice, because the victims were African and the aggressor was useful. In this brutal new proxy war, truth itself had become a casualty, and Captain Traoré stood as one of the few willing to name the enemy hiding behind friendly flags. And yet, despite the bloodshed, the betrayal and the silence, something else was quietly taking shape. In the heart of West Africa, where foreign flags once flew over military compounds, and foreign aid came with invisible chains, a storm was beginning to rise, but not a loud one, a quiet storm, the kind that starts in whispers and ends in waves. Captain Ibrahim Traore had seen enough. So had his allies in Mali and Niger, and together the nations of the alliance of Sahel states drew a line not just in the sand, but in history. This wasn't just resistance, it was awakening. In September 2024, Burkinabe activists, civil society groups, and Pan-African coalitions began to speak openly. They named Ukraine not as a victim of war, but as an aggressor in Africa's shadow conflict. They accused the West of using Kiev as a proxy to weaken Africa's growing alliances with Russia, alliances based not on exploitation, but mutual respect. The African Network for Solidarity and Development released a powerful joint statement condemning the deliberate sabotage of African stability. Their warning was sharp. We see what you are doing. We will not remain silent. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, the narrative shifted. No longer were these attacks seen as isolated tragedies. They were recognized for what they were: coordinated strikes in a larger battle for control over Africa's future. Captain Ibrahim Traore, long dismissed as radical by Western commentators, now emerged as a symbol, not just of defiance, but of clarity. In his speeches, he no longer asked for support. He called for unity, for discipline, and for vision. We are not children, he said. We are a people choosing our path, and we will not be threatened into turning back. In a world where African lives are too often reduced to footnotes, Traoré's defiance hit a nerve. Because he refused to mourn in silence. He refused to pretend that the deaths of Malian soldiers meant less than those of mercenaries. And he refused to let the Sahel remain a playground for foreign powers. Still, the United Nations did nothing. The letter jointly submitted by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso calling for an investigation into Ukraine's alleged support for terrorism sat unanswered. No resolutions, no debate, only silence. But silence, as Traoré knew too well, is not the same as peace. Instead of retreating, the alliance doubled down. It strengthened security ties with Russia. It invested in domestic defense industries. It launched educational campaigns to expose disinformation and neo-colonial propaganda. For Traoré and the AES bloc, the war wasn't just in the forests or the deserts. It was in the minds of the next generation, and it had to be won. So when the cameras turned away and the headlines moved on, the people of the Sahel kept building. Not just bunkers or alliances, but belief. A belief that Africa has the right to define its own enemies, to name its own heroes, and to tell its own story. That story is not over, but it has begun. And Captain Ibrahim Traore is writing it one line at a time. The world may still pretend not to see, but Africa sees everything now, and it will not forget. What happened in Kazan wasn't just a diplomatic rupture. It was a revelation, a reckoning. The curtain was pulled back, and the shadows behind global politics were exposed in daylight. For decades, African nations were told their suffering was the result of internal weakness, of tribal divisions, of poor governance. But the truth was always more complex and far more sinister. Today, with voices like Captain Ibrahim Traore, leading the charge that truth is finally being spoken aloud. Traoré represents more than a single nation. He is the embodiment of a regional awakening. A generation raised under broken promises and manipulated treaties is now choosing to step into its own power, and that power does not come from foreign weapons or international approval. It comes from the courage to name what has long been denied, that Africa's chaos has been engineered, that its conflicts have been prolonged, that its sovereignty has been sold, and too often at gunpoint. When Ukraine admitted on national television to aiding militants in the Sahel, and when no outrage followed, the message was clear. African deaths don't carry the same weight. The lives of Malian soldiers, of Burkinabe villagers, of Tuareg civilians caught in crossfire, they are statistics to some, political leverage to others, but not to Captain Traoré, not to the people who are building a new Africa with blood in their hands and fire in their hearts. The silence of Western institutions, from the United Nations to NATO, is not neutrality, it is complicity, because silence in the face of evidence is not ignorance, it is a decision. And Captain Ibrahim Traore has decided that Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel will no longer wait for justice to be handed down from foreign capitals. Justice will be forged through unity vision and relentless determination. The Sahel has known war. It has known betrayal, but now it knows its enemies, and more importantly, it knows its own strength. The alliance of Sahel, states Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, was not born of convenience. It was born of necessity, a survival pact in a world that had grown comfortable treating Africa as a resource, not a partner. Today, that alliance is building roads, training soldiers, rewriting textbooks, and planting flags of dignity where shame once stood. It is redefining what it means to be sovereign. And while the West may still look away, pretending the house isn't burning, the people of Africa are learning to build in the smoke. Captain Ibrahim Traore is not asking for permission. He is not seeking validation. He is standing head unbowed, boots planted firmly in Burkinabe soil, and declaring that Africa belongs to Africans, not in theory, not in treaties, but in truth. The war for sovereignty is not over, but it is no longer hidden, and this time the world will not write the ending. Africa will. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall even when the giants of the world try to crush it, If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story, not in someone else's accent, not with borrowed hands, but in its own voice, its own truth. And if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traore's eyes, the kind that refuses to be dimmed even in the darkest storm, then this story isn't just his. It's yours too. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, not just to show support, but to stand together, because this isn't entertainment. This is resistance. This is the heartbeat of a continent waking up. And the whispers that once went unheard have now become a silent storm rolling across the Sahel, breaking through the lies and calling a new Africa into being. History is shifting. Stand with those who dare to shape it. The story that unfolded from Kazan to Ouagadougou is more than a geopolitical scandal. It is a moral compass pointing to truths the world too often refuses to confront. One of the first and most striking lessons from this episode is the hypocrisy embedded within international systems of power. The swift silence that followed Ukraine's televised admission of intelligence collaboration with armed groups in Mali was not just disappointing, it was revealing. It showed us that global outrage is not evenly distributed, that the value of human life is in practice deeply political. When Western soldiers or allies fall, headlines scream, but when 47 Malian soldiers die beside 84 Russian operatives in a coordinated attack, the world barely blinks. This imbalance teaches us that justice, as it currently stands, is not blind, but selective. Another sobering lesson is the ongoing reality of proxy warfare on African soil. For decades, African leaders have warned that their lands were being used as battlegrounds for foreign agendas. This case provides compelling evidence that those warnings were not paranoia, but prophecy. If the reports and intelligence are accurate, if Ukraine indeed collaborated with local militants and separatist groups to weaken Russian influence in the Sahel, then Africa has once again become a chessboard in a larger game. The lesson here is not simply that proxy wars exist, but that they often operate beneath the radar of mainstream discourse. Africa is not just suffering from its own internal fractures, but from external forces actively fueling instability for geopolitical leverage. To ignore this is to ignore the structural roots of many African conflicts. The resilience of leadership is another key theme, most powerfully embodied in the figure of Captain Ibrahim Traore. His response to the revelations was not merely political, it was deeply symbolic. In a world that expects African leaders to remain deferential, cautious, or silent, Traoré spoke with clarity and defiance. He named the silence, he named the injustice, and he named the systems behind it. From him, we learn the importance of moral courage, the ability to lead not with fear or favor, but with unwavering commitment to truth and sovereignty. His stance is a reminder that leadership is not just about governance. It is about vision, memory, and refusing to forget who pays the price when the powerful play games. A fourth lesson lies in how information is weaponized or buried. The Western media's framing of the Mali attack focused almost exclusively on the Russian casualties. This wasn't just poor journalism, it was a choice. By omitting the African deaths, the media sent a message, consciously or not, that African lives are peripheral to the story. The role of media in shaping public consciousness cannot be understated. This incident teaches us to look beyond headlines, to question the silences, and to ask whose pain is being acknowledged and whose is being ignored. In the information age, ignorance is no longer innocent, it is complicit. Moreover, the reaction of African civil society shows us that the continent is not waiting for external permission to speak out. The statements from the Burkina-Russia Coalition, the Pan-African Revolutionary Councils, and the Black Defense League of Burkina Faso were not just protests, they were a declaration. These groups named Ukraine as a tool of neo-colonial disruption, accusing it of serving Western interests under the guise of being a victim itself. The lesson here is that grassroots movements are no longer whispering. They are organizing, documenting, and calling for accountability in ways that rival state institutions. Africa's awakening is no longer theoretical. It is happening in real time, and it is driven not just by governments, but by everyday citizens who have learned to read between the lines. A sixth lesson concerns alliances and how they are formed. The West often speaks of partnerships with Africa, but what we see in the AES-Russia alliance is something radically different. These are not alliances of dependence, but of choice. The Sahel states, frustrated with decades of broken promises from France and its NATO allies, chose Russia not because it is flawless, but because it offered respect and a policy of non-interference. In doing so, these nations exercised agency. The lesson here is that African countries are not passive players on the global stage. They are capable of assessing their interests and making strategic decisions based on dignity, not fear. The backlash they've received for doing so is proof that true independence remains a threat to old power structures. Lastly, perhaps the most profound lesson is, this silence is never neutral. When the United Nations fails to investigate damning allegations, when NATO says nothing, when powerful governments shrug off accusations of state-supported terrorism, that silence becomes part of the violence. It reinforces the idea that some regions are expendable, some deaths acceptable, and some truths too inconvenient to face. Captain Ibrahim Traore and his allies have chosen not to be silent. Their refusal to play along with the polite fictions of international diplomacy is a call to the rest of the world to speak, to act, and to care. In conclusion, the unfolding story of Ukraine's alleged involvement in Sahel terrorism is not just about foreign interference. It is about systems of power, of media, of silence, and how those systems are being challenged. It is about the moral failure of institutions that claim to protect human rights, but look away when the victims are African. And it is about the moral clarity of a new generation of African leaders and citizens who are rewriting what sovereignty truly means. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this: Africa is not asking for a seat at someone else's table. It is building its own, and the world would do well to pay attention. Viewers from across the continent and beyond were quick to respond with emotion, clarity, and a deep sense of urgency. One viewer wrote that they had never seen the geopolitical game laid out so clearly before. For them, the events described were not shocking because they were new, but because they had always suspected it, and now there was finally evidence. We were told our chaos was our own fault, they commented, but now we see it's being managed from afar. Captain Ibrahim Traore is not just standing up for Burkina Faso. He's standing for all of us. Another comment posted under the name Voice from Accra described the story as a slap of cold truth, noting that African nations have long been manipulated, divided, and sacrificed for the interests of foreign powers. They praised the clarity of Traore's leadership and demanded that the African Union break its silence. What more proof do we need, they asked. Drones marked in Ukrainian, intelligence shared on live TV, 47 Malian soldiers dead. Where is the outrage? Where is the justice? Others turned their frustration toward Western institutions. One viewer pointed out the double standards with visible anger. If an African state had admitted to supplying weapons to terrorists in Europe, the world would explode. Sanctions would fall like rain. But because it's Ukraine backed by the West, there's nothing but silence. This is not just hypocrisy. It's racism repackaged in diplomatic language. That comment gained hundreds of likes and sparked a thread where others expressed similar sentiments, that African lives were treated as lesser in global media and politics. Some expressed admiration not only for Captain Traoré, but also for the unity displayed by the Sahel Alliance. The AES has become a symbol of hope for millions of Africans, one user wrote. 3 nations that once bowed to French pressure are now rewriting the rules. They are showing that Africa doesn't need to beg, it only needs to believe. They ended their comment with the phrase, "Africa is awake, and we won't go back to sleep." Others saw the situation as a wake-up call for youth. One young commenter writing from Nairobi said they had never taken much interest in politics until now. "I used to think it didn't matter who we aligned with, West, East, whatever. But after hearing how our people are being used as pawns, something changed in me. We can't afford to be passive anymore. We have to be informed. We have to choose our future, not have it chosen for us. One particularly emotional comment came from a former soldier in Mali. He wrote anonymously saying that he had lost friends in the July 2024 attack. He thanked the video for telling their side of the story. No one ever talks about the Malian soldiers who died, only the Russians. But my brothers were there. They weren't terrorists. They were defending their land, and they were killed with foreign weapons. That's not a battlefield, that's a betrayal. Some viewers took a broader view, drawing connections to other conflicts and injustices across the continent. One comment read, "This isn't just about the Sahel. It's the same pattern in Congo and Sudan and Ethiopia. Foreign hands stirring local fires, then selling us water at a price. The only difference now is that leaders like Traoré are naming names and refusing to be quiet." That comment ended with a simple line that resonated deeply: truth is revolutionary. There were also reactions from the diaspora. A user from London, identifying as second-generation Ghanaian, wrote, "I used to feel disconnected from all this, like Africa's struggles were distant memories. But watching this, I felt it in my bones."